Really excited about this program, and we're exceptionally pleased to welcome Ken Jarrett and his team from the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Is this the second or third time we've hosted you guys now, Ken? Is this the second or third time we've hosted you guys now? I think second, yeah. So great to have them back, and with a report that is not their typical report, but actually a special one that has come out on these subjects that we're all spending a lot of time looking at. And I think you're going to find the results very, very intriguing. Scott and I had the pleasure to have a look at it as in the run-up to this, and I think it's really revealing about what it tells us about what's really happening on the ground and how companies are thinking about the impacts. You know, we all see all these headlines every day, and we think, okay, well, it's back and forth between President Trump and President Xi and so on, but this is what's happening on the ground. I think that's very important. So I have the great pleasure to introduce to you all Ken Jarrett, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Ken has served as the president of the American Chamber in Shanghai since September 2013. Prior to that, he was the Greater China Chairman for APCO Worldwide from 2008 to 2013. He also served as a U.S. diplomat from 1982 to 2008, during which he served as Consul General in Shanghai, Deputy Consul General in Hong Kong, and Director of Asian Affairs at the White House National Security Council. He also served in Beijing, Chengdu, Singapore, and had several assignments in Washington, D.C. Ken has degrees from Cornell University, Yale University, and the National War College, and he's the recipient of the Magnolia Award Silver from the Shanghai government and is a member of the National Committee for U.S.-China Relations. So I don't think we could have a better guest to lead us off, and please join me in welcoming Ken to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I see there's a contingent of past consul generals from Shanghai in the back, so you can ignore them. Actually, it's the Magnolia Award is the highest of all of the honors. So very pleased to be with all of you today. Actually, we have two reports I'm going to summarize a bit, so this is a twofer in the New York Broadway lingo. But just to give a bit of context, we're here on our annual door knock visit. We have a delegation of 15 companies who are with us, and the purpose of the door knock is to give a view from the field. There's no shortage of expertise in Washington, D.C. about China, but we do feel that we have a special perspective because of the companies who are working sort of on the front lines of doing business in China, and to make sure that people in Washington are able to get the benefit of that knowledge to augment what they're reading in the press and other sources of information. So this is our second day. The first day was spent making the rounds of the administration. Today we started with the Hill. We'll continue with that tomorrow, and then we're heading up to New York for a short program in New York City as well. This year's visit in particular is well-timed or ill-timed, depending on your point of view. It's definitely, we're in Washington at a time of great attention to China, or great churning on China, as there is this assessment of the U.S.-China relationship underway, concerns about China's resurgence and what this might mean for the United States. You know, from the Chinese perspective, since we spend a lot of time in China, and in China, what they would view as growing American hostility toward China, and what that might mean as well. So in the door knock this week, we're talking to members of Congress and the administration in terms of what companies are experiencing in China, with a particular focus on the impact of the tariffs, which is very much on people's minds. Then also talking about what direction we feel the administration should go. And that's a very important part of the discussions of the what are our asks of Washington, D.C. to help life better for U.S. companies, which we believe is the important objective. So on the, okay, just get oriented here. Okay, so that's so I have two surveys, because one, and I'll go through the first one fairly quickly because it was issued in July, and you might have seen that, or it's in the fast-moving world of U.S.-China relations, it's already certainly old news by now, even though it's just sort of 2 months old. But that's our annual business climate survey. But it does provide, I would say, a valuable baseline in terms of how to look at the current situation today, because that's what gives us the richer source of data in terms of how companies are doing in terms of business performance, profitability, revenue, what are the investment inclinations. But it is important to, I'll just turn to the first slide so you can look at some of the context here. So the date, the survey, again, it's sort of April was the main collection date. So this was before tariffs had been put in place, which is important to keep in mind. When this survey was collected, companies were coming out of a very strong 2017, and at the time they were actually feeling quite optimistic about 2018. So you'll see in the numbers that the performance is relatively strong. But it was a good sample size, about 30% of our membership, as the numbers show, a certain tendency toward larger companies and companies who have been in the market for quite some time. The surveys, so I'll go through the key categories for performance, and we'll look at investment. Then I want to spend a bit of time on the obstacles that companies face in China. These are both sort of operational as well as regulatory hurdles that they face in this important market. But starting with perhaps the good news first in terms of performance, as you'll see, companies basically had 3 years of improving performance. If you look at both profitability, revenue, and improving margins, profitability, I mean, this was neutral at 77%, but it is perhaps a fact that's overlooked by many in the United States as they think about U.S. companies in China, that in fact the majority of companies are indeed profitable. It doesn't mean all, and there are tremendous differences by industry, which you have to bear in mind. But in general, most companies have enjoyed good performance, and that performance has been improving over the last couple of years. So if you break it down by industry, by sector, so I'm just looking to see what's there. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see that in fact the performance was best for the manufacturing sector, sort of at 83%. And this actually reflects 3 straight years of improvement for manufacturing coming out of 2015, which was sort of a rough year for manufacturing, but since then, sort of they've been on the uprise. If you were to look at profitability just by a couple of industries specifically, and when I talk about percentage of profitability, just to make sure you understand what the number means, it simply means what percentage of companies in that industry reported that they were profitable, right? So I'm not saying that they were profitable, that they had 77% profits, right? That would be a little bit, or maybe be nice to have, but not very realistic. But the strongest industries, so chemicals, 93% were profitable, automotive, 89%, retail consumer, 81%. The ones that were weakest, and one of our takeaways from this year's survey is that the services sector is the one that seems to be hurting the most relative to others. And this also reflects perhaps the lack of significant market access changes in that particular sector. But real estate and engineering and construction services, only 53% were profitable, and legal services, only 50% were profitable. And so those are a couple of industry breakdowns. So to look just at revenue growth, so here you want to look at the top 3 colors, because that represents sort of growth in revenue, and then we break it down by how large that revenue growth actually is. Here too, improvement, so 77% were enjoying revenue growth, and this is versus 73% in 2016 and 61% in 2015. So a very decided trend. We'll have to see, when we do the survey for the next cycle, what that shows. And for many companies, they find that their revenue growth in China is higher than their global revenue growth. So this was true of 58%, which was up a bit from the previous year, where it was up 7.7%. And by sector, so retail and manufacturing were enjoying sort of the biggest increase in revenue growth. And again, a couple of industry breakdowns. These are they're not there, but chemicals, strong revenue growth, pharmaceutical sector, medical device, life science, these are 2 very highly performing industries. In the area of investment, so here, not too much change this year. Investment increase, relatively flat. About 62% of the members said that they expect to increase their investment this year. So this is a figure that, again, is very time sensitive, is the only way to describe it, because remember, this was taken pre-tariffs. If we were to ask this question now, I suspect we would get a very different figure, because we are seeing that in light of the tariffs, many companies are postponing decisions about investments, and they're waiting on the sidelines at the moment. But still, as we were at the beginning of the year, you had this level of plans for investment increases. And in 2017, we saw that 53% of the companies had made investment increases over the previous year. And in general, China still ranks as a high investment priority on a global basis for most companies. So as the number one global investment priority, that's true of 27% of the companies. 30% had it as second or third. So for a large number of companies, China still is in the top 3 of their global investment priorities. In terms of headcount changes, so 64% actually plan to increase their headcount this year. So this was an increase over the previous 2 years, which had been 60% last year and then 49% the year before that. Optimism, the optimism index, so to speak. This is a question we've asked for many years running, and it's simply asking our members to project out 3 to 5 years and to indicate what their outlook is in that given time frame. And it's flat is the best way to describe it. It's the same at 80%. The mix within that 80% is a little bit improved in terms of those who are optimistic as opposed to simply slightly optimistic, but I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from that. And you'll see that, this is down. If you go back to 08, 09, 010, optimism in China was off the charts, and it was always in the 90 percentile. And since then, it has come down significantly from those years. I don't know if you had a parallel survey for other markets around the world, I don't know actually what a benchmark would be. But against past benchmarks, 80%, it definitely isn't moving up at all, so it's been moving down in recent years. And it's more the trend line that's significant as opposed to what any individual figure is. So let's turn to challenges, because I don't know, perhaps all these initial slides will lead you to the conclusion that things are wonderful in China and that there's really nothing to talk about, which isn't the case. So there are plenty of problems that companies face. And as we look at the problems, we divide these into regulatory and operational challenges. So here's our list of the top regulatory challenges that companies face, and I've highlighted at least the top 3. Lack of IPR protection. So this is something that does fit into the administration's actions in terms of the Section 301 report. When we ask our members, intellectual property rights protection is the top of the list of what they describe as something that is a hindrance to them on the regulatory side. And that has not changed too much. You'll see here that the 2017-2018 variation is relatively modest. I mean, interestingly, of these 7 categories here, you'll notice that in a number of them, there's been a slight decrease. I wouldn't get carried away at the magnitude of any change, but there is a bit of a downward turn on the regulatory obstacle side. Licenses and procurement round out the top 3. So those are the major regulatory challenges. We had other questions in the survey that touch on this issue. I don't have slides on them, but there is still a strong concern about the lack of impartiality on the part of the government. So we do find that 55% of our members feel that policies favor local companies. I think actually I do have that slide, yes. So you'll see here, if you look at favoritism toward local companies or foreign companies or being completely neutral, now here's how this breaks down. So 54% feel that the system or the playing field is tilted, it's biased toward local players. Now this is consistent with most of the other big surveys that are out there, whether AmCham China or the EU survey. And most feel that Chinese government policies toward foreign companies, well, a certain percentage feel that the conditions have actually worsened. So this is at 23%, which is down 10% from the previous year. And then you have some who feel that essentially the regulatory system, there hasn't been any change one way or another. So that was true of 43% of the respondents. And for the second year in a row, we had 60% of our members say that the regulatory system lacks transparency. So that also is something that requires increased attention from the Chinese government for sure. And if you look at that figure in terms of industries, the services sector was most critical of the lack of transparency. In terms of operational challenges, this list has been very stable actually for many years, meaning the top three has consistently been rising costs, domestic consumption, and the lack of talent and capabilities, the war for talent. And I would venture to say that this list, it may not be that different, frankly, if you were to survey companies in any range of economies, and it's to some degree almost a developed economy problem. So I don't think that there's anything so unique about the operational challenges. The internet restrictions, of course, this would be unique to China, something that is increasingly sort of on the mind of our member companies, and particularly when we ask them about the cybersecurity law. So we had a number of questions in the survey on that law explicitly to see what the impact has been. And for many companies, there is a significant amount of pain for this. There is both a budgetary cost of how to comply with the law, because companies are increasing their IT budgets significantly. But more important, many companies are saying that it's preventing them from leveraging their global IT systems. 31% said they had to establish local data center and a cloud presence, which is an added cost. And then 28% said it made them less willing to bring data into China. And in the whole area of the cybersecurity law, this is something where much of the implementing regulations have not been forthcoming, and for companies it's something very much on their mind and something they need to continue to grapple with. So I'm getting closer to the new survey, but I just have a couple of points still on the July survey. So in the July survey, we had a number of questions on what were some very topical issues, and I have a couple of slides here. One is Made in China 2025, which also has been a big topic of discussion in the policy making world here in Washington in particular. And sort of an interesting response from our members, namely that 48% of them actually see it as a revenue opportunity. And perhaps this reflects the natural optimism of the business community, that when there are opportunities out there, they want to grab them. But it is something that perhaps it doesn't get too much attention here in Washington. And I do want to note that for 24% of the respondents to the survey, they did have a negative view, and these are the three categories on the left of the slide. And just one, I think this is the last one on the survey, on pressure to transfer technology. So in the survey question, and it is important to just highlight the word that we use. So we didn't use the word forced technology transfer, because we were concerned that if we use the word force, you get into a very sterile debate about what is actually forced. So the way we phrased the question was exactly, we have the whole question up there just to make sure you know exactly how we put the question to our members. And 21% said that they do feel pressure to transfer technology to Chinese companies or partners to participate in the China market. And I would interpret this as a significant figure. So you might just look at the number and say that 21% is actually small, but that's not really the case, because for many members, there isn't any technology that they would transfer, so they're immediately out of the equation. And so here you see the 23% who say it's not applicable. And then if you look at certain high-tech areas, so here I note that for aerospace and chemicals, you have quite large numbers who are saying that they face this pressure, the demand or the expectation from China that if you want access to the market, you're going to have to share technology. So there are a couple of other questions in the survey. Here too I don't have slides per se, but in terms of views on retaliatory tariffs as a policy measure, we did have a question on that. And only 8.5% of our members at that time favored the use of tariffs, and 69% were opposed. We also had a question on the Belt and Road Initiative. Here, too, a certain percentage of the membership is looking to or expects to benefit from the business opportunities. This was 16% believed that they could directly benefit, and 36% felt that they would indirectly benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, so that's one down, one to go. So the new survey, the one that is quite recent, and we did this together with AmCham China, and my colleague, Al Bibi, the president of AmCham China, is here, and he's also part of our door knock. This was I think the first time in many years that the two chambers did a survey together, so for those of you who think that there's something about chamber politics to pay attention to, I take this as an example that there actually aren't chamber politics anymore. So we collaborated on this survey. And we had, a very good response rate here too, over 400. This was collected late August up into September 5, and it was released just last week. So it's pretty much hot off the press. And the reason for the survey was really to get a useful set of data about what is the impact of tariffs, because there's all this discussion of tariffs, and yes, the press has this anecdote or that anecdote about a particular company, but there wasn't any large data set out there that really tried to look at this in a serious way. So we're the first ones to tackle this, and I suspect, or I hope we don't have to do another survey, but we might have to, actually. So first, looking at the U.S. tariffs. So you'll see that in the survey, we do, of course, differentiate between U.S. and Chinese tariffs. And just to remind you that when the survey was taken, the announcement about the $200 billion had not yet been made. So when companies were talking about the potential negative impact of the $200 billion, in a sense, this was an anticipatory impact, should they be enforced. So you'll see here that even the $50 billion, I would interpret this as a rather significant negative impact. So the strong negative impact, 22%, and when you combine that with the slight negative impact, so well over the majority of companies are experiencing some negative impact from the tariffs. And when you talk about the $200 billion, you'll note that the strong negative impact more than doubles. So it goes from 22% to 47%, which is quite a dramatic increase. Chinese tariffs. Here too, the $50 billion, 16% strong negative impact, and then when you add the slight negative impact, also well over 60%, and it also has a similar increase in scale when you talk about the 60 billion. So it goes from 16 to 38, so there's a dramatic change in terms of the strong to slight. They actually flip. But interestingly, for our members, you'll see that the impact of the U.S. tariffs actually are stronger than the impact of the Chinese tariffs, which I'm sure isn't the intent of the administration, but that's what's actually happening on the ground. And this reflects the supply chain and the role of intermediate goods and things that are going back and forth. In terms of the impact on business operations, so we look both at operations and strategy, but just on operations, you'll see that, of course, it's increasing the costs, decreasing demand is having an effect on profits and on revenue. So it is having a significant impact already. And this is simply talking about the set of 50. So for these slides, we're only talking about the tariffs that were already in place. And in terms of impact on strategy, this perhaps is the more interesting of the two slides, because you will see that it is causing companies to delay decisions on investment. You'll see a lot of looking around at the supply chain to see where there might be alternative suppliers. Here I should point out that it's something that always takes place, particularly as you have the rising costs in China that I referred to. Depending on what you're manufacturing, people are always attuned to the need to find alternative sources of supply. And for some time, there's been a desire by many companies to have a China plus one strategy. And so that's, so the only question is, to what extent is this higher than it would have been in the absence of tariffs? And it definitely is higher. But that's a question I actually can't answer. But in terms of exiting the China market, only 3% said that they were even considering that, so a pretty small number. And considering relocation, some of all manufacturing out of China, so 18% there. So you can see that, here too on strategy, a significant impact. In terms of non-tariff barriers, if you listen to the Chinese government on their response to the tariffs, they've spoken of they have two weapons of choice. They have quantitative weapons and they have qualitative weapons as well. So they can't match the U.S. dollar for dollar, but they are things that they can do in the regulatory world to make life miserable for U.S. companies operating in China. So we did ask this question about the non-tariff barriers. So you have the 48% who aren't experiencing any change, but there was a significant number that is experiencing either slower decision-making or even slower review at customs. So you'll see here the 27% in terms of increased inspections and 23% for increased customs clearances. At the extreme end, so at the far right, for these other categories, the numbers are quite small. So that's more consistent with what the Chinese government at very senior levels has emphasized, which is that they would not be taking measures against U.S. companies. So for the inspections and things of that sort, of course, it's hard to understand exactly what might be going on, whether this is central government directed or is it simply overzealous officials who are doing things that they feel the central government would like them to do, or if it's some other dynamic at play. And planning to relocate manufacturing, because for the administration, I believe that this is one of the hopes that American companies would decide to return more manufacturing back here to the United States. So far, we're not seeing this in any meaningful way. So you see that only 6% of the companies are looking at relocating back to the United States. To the extent that they're looking at other locations, Southeast Asia is the area that gets the most attention. And this is quite consistent with the data number that we've seen each year in the annual business climate survey, where reshoring back to the United States has consistently come in at a single digit. So typically 4 or 5 or 6%, and Southeast Asia has always been on top. So that's it for the two surveys. Just to note that the full survey set, all the data is on our website, so if you'd like to see more, I would just urge you to take a look there. And with that as setting the scene for the panel discussion, I'm going to abandon the podium, but thank you for your attention.
Ken, thank you very much. My name is Scott Kennedy. I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair here in China Studies at CSIS, and we're delighted to again have AmCham Shanghai with us, as well as folks from their allies to the north, AmCham China. I'm glad that they've resolved all of the north-south differences that separate them between the the Yangtze and that's sort of the old Song Dynasty challenge, I suppose. This is the second year that we've had AmCham Shanghai here to talk about how the U.S.-China relationship looks like from their perspective of their members. We've done this as well with other groups, and I think it's really important that Washington, D.C. remember that there is life beyond the Beltway. That we're making policy for a global economy and our companies that are operating all over China. So we really appreciate the partnership and the opportunity. I think the first thing I wanted to do is introduce my colleagues here up on stage who are involved deeply in China, as well as AmCham Shanghai, and then begin a conversation with them that to some extent look at their own experiences and through the lens of some of the results that Ken just shared with us. And then turn things over to all of you for a vigorous conversation, which I know that you all will enthusiastically participate in. All right. To my immediate left is Anita Wei, who is Senior Director in Public Affairs and Communications for BD Greater China, a medical technology company. She's been with the firm for several years, is responsible for helping them explain to China and the rest of the world what they do with relation to safety, with enhancing their partnerships with commercial and industry associations in China, and leading one of their policy councils. She previously worked with Novartis, and we're really delighted to have you here at CSIS. In the middle, Han Shunlin, you'll recognize him because Han was did so well last year and brave enough to come again. Hanlin is the Deputy General Manager of Wells Fargo Shanghai and a Senior Relationship Manager of Global Banking in China for Wells Fargo. He focuses heavily on cross-border strategic financing and trade needs. He's also currently the chair of the Financial Services Committee of AmCham Shanghai. And we're delighted to have you back here again for another year and look forward to your comments. And at the end of the table, Eric Zheng, who is the chairman of AmCham Shanghai. And he's long served on the Board of Governors and many other positions in the chamber. He also previously was the president and CEO of AIG China, so has particular expertise on the insurance industry, but is here today going to primarily talk about how things look through his position as chairman of AmCham Shanghai. So we have three extremely knowledgeable, experienced experts to elaborate on some of the points that Ken demonstrated at the macro level that came through the survey. So I think actually before we talk about all the policy nuts and bolts and all of the things that lead us to be depressed in Washington, I'd like to just step back for a second and just talk about your businesses, or the businesses that you're familiar with in the case of Eric as well. Tell us a little bit more about what your companies are doing first in China, and whether you're there because of China being a part of global supply chains, and what those supply chains look like, or for the China market itself, or both. And you know, how does the Chinese economy and your business look there? Before we get into all the policy and the nitty-gritty and all that stuff, just sort of gives people some tangible sense of where your perspectives come from the jobs that your companies do on a day-to-day basis. Why don't we start with Anita, and then we'll go to Hanlin and work down to Eric.
Thank you, Scott, and truly honored to be here to share some of our perspectives. So Becton & Dickinson, as Scott described, we are a 121 years medical technology company headquartered in Franklin Lakes in the States here, and we have been in China operating for 24 years. I think our revenue is going to hit $1 billion in China, and we have 3 plants in Suzhou and Jiangsu province, and actually most of the revenue contribution are coming from 70% actually coming from imported products, because most of our products right now are selling in China, especially on the high-end ones, are imported from US. And we have the 3 plants who supplies the local markets with 30% of our production supporting the local market needs. I think in terms of performance, we have been enjoying quite good, strong and very profitable growth in China for the last decades. And since the new normal in 2014, we have seen a bit of a slowing down of the industry. But we can still remain about double-digit growth in a low teen, talking about 14 to 15% of growth on annual basis for the past several years. And I think overall in the healthcare industry, the multinational companies are still competing very competitively in the market, because many of the high-end products, especially on the instruments and the IVDs, and also the high-value consumables like the stent and the implants and the total lab solution, those are still mainly imported from US or from Europe, some of the leading European companies. Do you think
Terrific, thank you.
Thank you.
So Scott, thank you. It's a privilege to be back here for the CSIS panel session here. And just a few comments. There's always an understanding that when US companies do well, the financial institutions that support them do well as well. And a lot of the US companies involved in China, they tend to fall under 3 models. Some of them are U.S. exporters selling into China. Others manufacture from within China but sell globally, while a third manufacture in China specifically to sell within the China market. And among all the various financial institutions, of which Wells Fargo that I belong with is one of them, our job is essentially to help finance all of those strategies regardless of the business model. And to that extent, the companies continue to see China as a very vivid market. In fact, the trend over the last few years has been to gradually shift from exporting or trading with China to actually manufacturing to sell in China, particularly given a lot of positive environments such as the growing middle class. But when we talk about the financial services, we have not only the banks, but also the securities firms, insurance, even asset management. So the scope of my answers that I give throughout the various questions will really be within that framework. So thank you. Yeah.
So as a service company, maybe I'm from the insurance industry, it's more on the non-life side, so property and casualty. The reason companies like AIG, Chubb, or Liberty Mutual wanted to be in China, we started to support our global clients, mostly our US clients, when they moved to China, right? So AIG started in 1992 to support our clients when they decided to invest in China. So that was the initial motive to move there. For AIG, certainly it was returning home, because AIG was founded in China in 1999. Actually, next year, AIG will celebrate its 100th anniversary. So it's in a special category. But initially, we went to China to support our global clients. And later on, certainly, we expanded our service to include Chinese companies, initially state-owned, and later private companies. And now, as Chinese companies are moving overseas, so-called going out, we follow them as well. So for service companies, we follow our customers, our clients, when they move either to China or move overseas. So generally speaking, you saw that statistic, service companies are not doing as well as manufacturing or retail companies. So only 65% of service companies are profitable relative to manufacturing companies, over 80%, or 83% to be exact. For our industry, most of our companies are still struggling as far as the bottom line. I'll give you a sense, in our industry, the universe is about 88 companies overall, both domestic and international. 22 of those are international companies, including US as well as from other countries. So in terms of absolute number, it's 1/4. But our market share is still relatively small at this point. Collective market share is 2%, and it hasn't gone up over the past few years. So when you don't have necessarily enough of scale, it's hard to be profitable. So that is an issue that service companies like insurance companies are struggling. They try to expand in China. But there's a way to be profitable. I'm using AIG as an example. In the past 2 years, 2016 and 2017, AIG was very profitable. So we managed to find a niche, to be a niche player in China. You don't want to be doing everything, particularly in our industry. Automobile insurance is big business, because in our business, 75% of our business is auto. But that's a very competitive market. But AIG is very good in certain niche markets like liability-related insurance. So it became very profitable. I'll give you a statistic. In terms of return on equity, ROE, in 2017, AIG reached, ROE was over 12%. That will rank AIG as a top 5 company among all companies, P&C companies in China, including the top 3, the big ones. So there's a way to make it work. And I think, in our industry, we continue to believe that the China market has a lot of potential, and it's a strategic market for US companies. We have to be there.
Super helpful. Thank you, each of you, for that. Let me ask one more sort of just general economics question, and then slowly turn towards policy. And I hope everyone will play along, because I'm trying to build momentum here and suspense. So I'm not a good author of those kind of novels or anything, but hopefully you get the point. So there's some folks in Washington who, in looking at the Chinese economy, recently has said that it's going off a cliff, it's suffering, it's doing really horribly. It's on its last legs. And I'm just curious, from the perspective of maybe your companies or your businesses, or just you live in Shanghai, you travel around China, does the deal with Chinese financial institutions, so you know what the debt situation is like. Does China's economy feel like it's teetering on the edge of collapse, or does it feel relatively robust? Does it feel are people there optimistic about the economic outlook? Because sitting in Washington, the idea is that it's very stormy clouds there.
Sure. I think the Chinese economy certainly is in transition from an export-driven, investment-driven economy to more of a consumer, consumption-driven economy. So the growth rate is leveling off. You can't expect a size of China to continue to grow in a double-digit kind of a pace. It is the second largest economy. Even with a 6.5 or just 6% GDP growth, we're talking about a huge size here. So when we look at China now, I think exports continue to play a major role, but the consumption driver, that engine, is going to play a huge role. And if you go to Shanghai or other places like Beijing, you see these young people shopping, and that's a huge engine for growth. Using our business as an example, we went into China as a commercial carrier, commercial insurance company, but in the past few years, our consumer book has been growing tremendously. And right now, AIG, it's half and half. The consumer book is almost as big as its commercial book. When I say consumer, it's primarily travel insurance, accident and health. 2017, I think 120 million people from China travel overseas. So that's a huge market right there. So for us, we work with Alibaba. Certainly, you've heard about Tmall. So there is a B2C platform as part of the Alibaba network. So we have an online store to sell travel insurance, and that's doing very well. And AIG actually is a top insurance carrier on Alibaba in terms of selling travel. So I'm quite optimistic about the consumption growth in China, which I think U.S. companies certainly can take advantage of.
There are 3 data points that would suggest that the Chinese economy is much more robust than we may expect. The first one was, prior to coming over to DC, I had spent some time talking with the CFOs of the market leaders in China in the semiconductor industry, in milk, in industrial manufacturing, and in media. So kind of a cross-section of different industries. And I asked them, number one, are you planning to do any more overseas acquisitions to stimulate growth? And universally they said, probably not. They weren't so sure, number one, if the US was going to welcome it, but number two, there's always China's own capital controls that would help limit that as well. So where would that growth come from? And they all said that they could get sufficient growth just within the Chinese market alone. Now, the second data point is this. Within the banking industry, the Chinese regulators, specifically China Banking Insurance and Regulatory Commission, every half year pulls all of the foreign banks together and provides guidance and an outlook of where they think the economy is going to go. Now, some of the suggestions they gave us were, number one, be much more aggressive in supporting trade financing for Chinese exporters. Number 2, continue to help support the local economy and also to finance technology investments as well. And number 3, to consider real estate as well, not necessarily new developments, but rental housing. So, and so on and so forth, in this type of guidance, none of them, if you listen very carefully, are structural reform related. They tend to be very straightforward types of guidance of what banks can do without requiring a major restructuring in the way China runs its economy. But the third data point was this, and this hit more locally at home. The recruiting market from headhunters looking for bankers right now in China is exceptionally active right now. So there are tons of recruiters looking for bankers across coverage to cover different types of industries. Now, usually, if you have a slow economy, it wouldn't suggest such a robust headhunting market, but there you have it, especially during the summertime, it's been very popular. So we do know that the Chinese economy is much different than it was 10 years ago, perhaps more consumption-based, less focused on dependency of trade. But certainly, at least in the last year or so, what we've seen so far is that the economy is pretty strong.
I think because our headquarters for Greater China is in Jing'an area, which is most central area of Shanghai. So if you're going around to see the shops and like all the restaurants, you won't see any sign of slowing down of the economy, as Eric just mentioned. I think for healthcare sector particularly, I just mentioned that our company revenue is going to hit $1 billion this year, and we are looking for double our business size in 3 to 5 years. So why we are so confident? Because we have the largest population in China. That's definitely something. And also the government is investing heavily on healthcare reform to trying to improve the livelihood and well-being of Chinese population, which is part of the President Xi Jinping's China dream, right? And also, of course, with the rising middle income population who are not right now in an age of need a lot of medical care, but they are the caregivers for the aging population in China. So we see that as a positive sign, and also the prevalence of modern disease like the cancer and diabetes. So those actually are positive contributors for us to be very confident in this market. Of course, the tariff as on kind of like weaken our competitiveness to the local competitors or Japanese companies or European companies in this sector. But I think on high-value consumables or really high-tech technologies in this sector, we are still very much depending on the technologies that U.S. companies can provide.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Let me ask a question about some of the things Ken pointed to with regard to some of the obstacles in China, or things that may surprise us is not. Made in China 2025 is a 2-letter, 4-number bad word in Washington, D.C. Every member of Congress knows about it. You went up there today, you'll certainly hear a lot about it. But of course, that's just it was a report with an idea, and actually then there's lots of different policies, national and local. What are the biggest regulatory challenges that you all face, which are either industry-specific or directed at multinationals as a whole? What are the things that, if they disappeared, your prospects would be much, much brighter? So what are, why don't we start with Hanlin and then come this way and then back to Eric?
So, as we look at the tariff situation that's gone on, it has had 2 immediate impacts. The first one, specific to the financial sector side, has been various market reforms have happened at an accelerated pace. So, for example, the announcements that banks, security firms, insurance firms could all have higher equity stakes now. Now, it's quite possible the Chinese government was planning to offer them anyways, but there's a sense that probably the U.S. pressure, whether it be tariffs or some other forms, probably helped to accelerate that. But the second impact was this. for a lot of our clients, they immediately spent more time thinking about contingency plans, perhaps how to diversify any China-centric supply chains. So these are things that any risk management manager should always be thinking about these, but that might have also been accelerated as well. Now, as we look at the challenges going forward, specifically for financial services, regardless of whether you're in insurance, banking, securities, or asset management, the key function, the key skills you have to have is the ability to manage cross-border capital flows and to make sure you have the information, the data necessary to make these types of optimal decisions. So the challenges going forward are this. Number one, capital controls. One of the things that continue to be a source of uncertainty is the ability of U.S. companies to get their profits out of China. Now, these profits could be used for reinvestment, but also for the payment of salaries of U.S. workers as well as pensions. So that continues to be something that is a focus. But the second one, particularly for financial services to focus on, is the cybersecurity regulations. Now, again, that deals with the free flow of data, which financial services need access to. And at least as far as we understand, the regulations of what we're supposed to comply with are not yet too clear, nor are the deadlines, nor are the penalties for noncompliance. Now, it's been fairly quiet in the information front over the last year or so, but it's still a source of uncertainty, and within the financial services side that thrives on the movement of capital and information, those are road bumps to think about in the future.
I think from healthcare perspective, the biggest hurdle for us has been a long-standing issue, which is the market access issue. But when you talk about market access issue, I think for healthcare sector particularly, I think it's two levels, right? So one is around the central government level, more about the new product registration, where some of the issues are around whether or not the country of origin is acceptable, acceptance of foreign clinical trial data, which is significant delay of the market access, the registration of new products into the market for at least 3 to 5 years. That has been a long-standing issue. But for medical device sector, there's also the classification of products. For instance, a class 1 medical device that accepted in U.S. is probably classified as class 2, which requires clinical trial or registration at national level. So that slows down the market access piece. But the second level of market access, I think, is very important, is around the pricing and the reimbursement, because medical device or healthcare industry is very different from other industries, because the government from their medical insurance funding basically is the major source of buying all those healthcare services. So that's why the government is paying a lot of attention on curbing the price and the reimbursement for the products. But that side of market access hurdles normally lies in provincial government or even municipal government, because those are the local government that are paying for that services. But I think for our industry, we have been seeing quite positive changes for the past 2 years, especially around the registration piece. The CFDA, now known as National Medical Product Administration Bureau, they actually are making a lot of progress in terms of having the green channel opened for truly innovative products, and also having the fast track type of a channel that opened for different products, and also accepting foreign clinical trial data. So those are the positive signs that we see. On the China Made 2025, high-end medical devices is actually within the scope of where the government want to provide more subsidies to kind of like help upgrade the local capacity in those areas, like stents and implants and the total lab automation. But if you really talk about the insiders in the healthcare sector in China, people will tell you that with China made 2025 or without it. There are still at least 10 to 20 years technology difference, for the Chinese local companies can really catch up with the really advanced technologies. So I don't think, I know there are a lot of talking in Washington that really sees that as a threat. We as our policy team, trying to explain to our headquarters, don't worry too much about it. I think there's still at least 10 years, for the local industry to really catch up.
In the insurance industry, certainly we have two types of insurance companies, life insurance companies and non-life. So for life insurance companies, certainly the number one issue is equity cap, because when China joined the WTO, there was no agreement to open up life insurance business to foreign participation. There was a requirement for a JV, a joint venture, 50-50. So, but the good news is that earlier this year, China made a commitment to lift its equity cap to 51% this year, meaning foreign companies can own a company up to 51% by the end of this year. And in 3 years' time, China is committed to open up life insurance companies completely. So meaning foreign companies can wholly own insurance companies in China. So that's a commitment that the Chinese government has made. I think Premier Li Keqiang recently reiterated that commitment when he was in Tianjin attending the summer Davos meeting, talking to reporters. For non-life companies, certainly it's open. The market is open. For instance, AIG owns 100% in China. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of AIG. Probably the one challenge is getting licenses. So as you probably know, to operate a financial service company in China, you need a license in each province. So at this point, I think most foreign insurance companies don't have enough licenses in China to be a national player. And that's probably one of the reasons why they don't necessarily have enough scale in China to be profitable. So I think foreign companies will love to have more licenses to operate in China. So that's a quick summary of the top regulatory barriers for insurance companies in China.
Terrific. Thank you all. I think very helpful. I'm trying to find a way to summarize the points of view and the conversations. And it's a complex sentence, and that sentence could be, there's some problems, market access problems, but overall the trend is positive. Or it could be, wow, we've got a relatively big market, but there's these areas that are really keeping us from expanding further. And I wonder if that's part of the disconnect between what life is like on the ground operating in China and what it's like operating, like living in Washington, D.C., where those in China say frame things in the first sentence and we frame things in the other direction. Yes, you're doing well, but, and we look out to the future. I want to have you hold off. I want you to just think about that for a little bit, but we've got a great crowd and audience here, very smart folks. I want to bring them in now. In CSIS tradition, if you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand. Someone will bring a microphone to you after we call on you, and if you could identify yourself and keep your question to a question. Who would like to go first? Yes, right here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, okay, so just from the survey, because I saw...
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
Okay, yeah, so my name's Jo, and I am actually at SIS. So I'm a student there, and I'm doing the China study and economics. So for me, I was quite interested about the survey, and I just want to ask about your perspectives. Because from the survey, we see that most companies say that there will not be a very serious impact from the tariffs. So I want to say, is that because the tariffs just implemented this year, so that in short term we cannot see the impact. But for a long term, probably like 5 years or 3 years, or at least until 2020, there should be a more serious impact for those companies in China.
Well, I think our survey results show that there is serious impact on our businesses. Certainly, when you look at 50 billion versus 200 billion, certainly the numbers will go up dramatically. So for us, actually in Washington this time, one of the messages we're trying to deliver to share with policymakers in Washington is that these higher tariffs are hurting U.S. companies operating in China, and they are also hurting U.S. consumers in a significant way, and it's not sustainable. And we need to have a strategy to move beyond tariffs to find realistic solutions to resolve these commercial issues between the two countries.
Maybe for our set, I think, as I just mentioned, I think very of the high-value consumables were very high-tech, big instrument for our healthcare sector are very much relying on imported products. So that's why I think overall the tariff will have a significant impact to our business in China. I think even though the annualized impact is not that significant if you look at this year, but I think the outlook is very concerned because many of our customers in Class 3 hospitals, which is the biggest like hospitals with 2,000 beds, they are very concerned because they are, on one side, they are facing the government and saying that we need the price erosion, policies. The hospitals needs to control their healthcare expenditure. But on the other side, with this tariff thing, even though they are willing to choose imported products, but with the tariff, that will lead to the increase the retail price, which put our customers, which is hospitals, in a very difficult position. Because normally when they do the purchasing at a hospital level, they do two classes. So one class is imported products, and one class is local made. So normally they will always have a space or a category for the imported. But right now with the tariff, I think the concerns is really with our customers. They are very concerned, so they are looking for alternatives either from Japan or from Europe or even local made.
That's a very good question. I was also a SAIS graduate, so I appreciate it. But certainly the impacts are taking effect. And so the question is, at what point or how long will it take effect? Because certainly the longer it's prolonged, the effect will be that much more. But at least what we've seen so far is, right now the U.S. economy is growing. The tax cut probably helped cushion some of the tariff impact, and therefore profitability has been growing, and thus the U.S. stock market continues to grow. And at least speaking with various folks in Washington, the political inclination hasn't been to stop it, at least in the near-term future. So we'll see how long this lasts, but hopefully we get to a point where various solutions come about.
All right. Let me just step in just with a little small question that's a footnote to Anita's answer. So you mentioned that the tariffs affecting prices, and you've got particularly on the different class of products, which is for local, one is. Isn't there something wrong with the system that divides medical equipment into local products and foreign products? And isn't there something reasonable to those who criticize China's system of having foreign products and local products? And yes, the tariff is the most recent challenge, but is there something to be said that shouldn't be a situation which one would want to allow to endure permanently and just accept as like just a natural part of the business landscape for China?
Thank you, Scott, for that question. Actually, I really want to add it on that point because I think there are a lot of confusions about why the provincial side, when they do the tendering, they have the two class, right? So the imported and the local. Actually, in operation, that is actually very good for us. In the healthcare sector, we always say that, long gone the good old days for the healthcare sector, especially, pharmaceuticals. They always enjoy very high price product for our category, particularly for medical device. If you are going into a provincial tender, you are classified as imported, so you are actually be able to charge a lot more than the local class. So that's why, we as multinational companies, when we go into the provincial level, we would like to be treated as different class, because if you are classified as the same, and then you will be only end up competing on price. So we are not going to win if we are competing only price with the local products. So in many of the cases, we are trying to maintain that type of different classification at provincial level. I know there are some changes already in some of the provinces saying that we should not treating or providing a differentiated class for the imported goods anymore. We see there are some provinces has already changing that, but majority of the provinces, when they do the tender, they still have separated class.
Scott, if I can add a comment on the impact on the supply chains. When you have higher tariffs, so certainly the Chinese side has implemented some retaliatory tariffs as well. So that forced some of our members to reconsider their supply chains. If they are bringing inputs from the US right now, they will have to take another look at this. So alternatively, they could source their inputs from other countries, which would not be good for the US. And also, this will disrupt our supply chains that have been built over the years. This is a challenge for businesses because you want certainty. And you don't necessarily want to change your supply chains just for a short term, like this month, next month, because of this temporary tariff situation. We want certainty. We want to plan for the future. Multi-year planning is very important for U.S. companies operating overseas. So this whole uncertainty is a huge challenge for us. So that's why we would like to have this issue resolved as soon as possible so that we can continue to bring inputs from the U.S. and not to move to somewhere else.
We're going to go here, and then maybe what we could do is collect several questions at once, and then we'll see here. So we'll come over here next after him, and then we'll come in the back. So yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm Mark Tokel from the Korea Economic Institute. I was struck by the increase of concern about corruption at a time that there's an anti-corruption drive taking place in China. So my questions are, how does corruption manifest itself? What are we actually talking about? Is it a local problem or a national problem? And is it a problem more for foreign companies, or do Chinese companies also believe there's an increase in corruption?
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. On the subject of intellectual property rights, do American companies find that local authorities are paying more attention to their problems? Are there any realistic improvements in the handling of intellectual property rights, or is this something that just continues to be a terrible problem that the Chinese government doesn't care that much about?
Hi, thank you, Yufan, also Sais. So my question is about Trump. It's basically, you must find it really frustrating talking to the White House here, because the presentation is, the picture you paint in the presentation is quite different from what Trump has been saying about trade war, about China's economy. So my question is basically, how do you guys plan to persuade Trump to keep up because I read the Woodward's book, basically Gary Cohen really trusted of Donald Trump, even cannot really persuade Trump to give up the idea of trade war. I'm just asking, how do you guys plan to, persuade him not to do that?
In the front, and then we'll deal with the four. Okay.
Thank you. Chunin Zhang from the World Bank. I have two questions about forced technology transfer in the presentation. Firstly, you said, I think if I remember correctly, 21% of the companies said they felt the pressure for technology transfer. Do you have any sense where the pressure came from? Is it specific from the government or from their joint venture partner or from the authorities who issue license? Or do you think that kind of distinction doesn't make any sense? That's number one. Number two question, do you have more information on this subject? For example, is it possible to say that over the last, say, 5 years, how many technology transfer agreements have been reached between the US companies and Chinese companies, and how much of them can be suspected as forced technology transfer, forced by whoever, government or company or whoever? Thank you.
All right, we've got a great group of questions related to tried and true topics, corruption, intellectual property rights, technology transfer, and then your private sit-down with President Trump that will happen tomorrow for breakfast, and how what you're going to say there. Feel free to take any of the four or all, and from your perspectives. Why don't we start with Eric?
Sure. On IP protection, certainly when you look at the laws and regulations, there's a pretty complete regime of laws and regulations protecting IP. I think the problem is in implementation, execution. And China certainly is a big country with many different provinces and localities, so the level of enforcement are different. When you look at places like Shanghai, where we are from, I think I would argue that there's probably a better environment to enforce IP protections. But when you go to the interior, certain places, maybe the levels are not there yet. So it is an issue. IP protection, for sure, it is an issue, and it's mostly in enforcement, not in laws and regulations. Now, as far as forced IP technology transfer, the Chinese government's made it very clear that it's not their policy. But from our survey, certain members from certain industry. Now, industry varies from industry to industry. Certain industries feel more pressure to share technology with their partners, JV partners. So that's what they are telling us. I don't think the central government has a policy to encourage that. That's not true, in my view. But in real practice, sometimes our U.S. companies do get pressure to share their technology. So that's kind of the reality, and IP protection is an issue. We have to face that. But I also like to highlight the fact that currently the U.S. enjoys a service surplus with China. A big part of it, certainly education, tourism, and so forth, but a big part of it is the royalty for IP. That's a big part of the surplus that the U.S. enjoys. So that shows you China is also buying IP from the U.S. So we have to look at this issue from both sides.
I'm going to echo what Eric said on the IP side. Really, the strength of China's intellectual property protection is really a function of the strength of China's legal system. And it wasn't really until 2012 where China went through a major civil procedure law reform, where they started to recognize the right of preservation of property, preservation of assets, things that we take for common under our common law system. But by 2014, 2016, there was the introduction of specialized intellectual property courts. And the reason driven by it was a shared interest between China and foreign countries, which was that they recognized as China was moving up the value chain, they needed to strengthen the IP. And certainly when you take a look at the number of cases for IP in China, 90% of it is Chinese entities suing Chinese entities. Now, when you take a look at the IP courts that are designated in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, and you take a look at the foreign cases involved, I read a statistic that surprised me, but that they said 90% of the cases where foreigners were involved, the foreigners won. Now, winning a case is not the same as collecting on damages. So that's a different side of the story, right? The enforcement side. And under Chinese law as it is, the maximum you can collect in damages, I believe, is 2 times expected losses. Now, don't quote me on it. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV either. But there's an imperative for China to strengthen it because of another reason, which is this. In order to expand One Belt, One Road, there has to be a clarified commercial dispute mechanism between China and with other countries, and that IP protection would facilitate it. So in this case, their improvements are also driven by their own self-interest.
Just very brief, I think on the corruption side, actually, I was a little bit surprised to see Ken's presentation just now, to see kind of like an increase of the member companies. I mean, that the 2018 is worse than 2017. I think, from our experience, I think it really depends on which government that you are dealing with. For Shanghai, for instance, I would say that they are very friendly. They're actually trying to help you solve some of the issues in the customs, especially if you are paying a lot of tax locally, right? So, of course, in some other provinces, for instance, the more inner land of China, like, Dongbei area, right, Shenyang. So those are the places where you can get, the cases where you have, kind of like random, not random, but it's really planned AIC kind of like checkup in your site, saying that because they have some annual target to really have the funds and trying to find something that you are doing something wrong, and then they can punish you with the fine for multinational companies. I would say that really depends on where you are operating. On the IPR, I think most of our multinational companies in China for healthcare sector, some of the leading ones, they have opened their R&D center for China, but I think mostly they are doing a line extension, like small innovation. I'm not talking about like a big blockbuster type of like innovation. So I haven't seen like significant IPR issues, at least for my company. And on the technology transfer, I know like 20 years ago, if you want to go into China, you need to form a partnership with a local pharmaceutical company. But later on, nowadays, I think all the multinational companies are like 100% foreign owned. So I don't think there is any forced technology transfer. At least I think, as Eric mentioned, there is no government policy say that you have to do this and that. And with Trump, if I had a chance to have breakfast with Trump, I would say that because healthcare is a very unique sector where that really leads the accessibility of the healthcare services or technologies that really helps to improve the well-being and even save lives. So I think, if there is any chance that our sector can get exclusion list from the tariff, that would be great, because we are really talking about preventing this type of very good technologies to save lives, but banned it because of this hurdle.
If I could add a comment, Scott, on IP, there are many innovative companies in China that are developing IP, and some of them actually are exporting their technologies to other countries, including the U.S. One of our colleagues, actually, Don, works closely with some of these companies, including Alibaba, investing in some of the startups in the Silicon Valley, and they are also demanding IP protection for their technology. So I think that, from that standpoint, long term, I think we have some allies in China as well working with us. Some of these companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, and so forth. It will be in their interest to have a more, strengthened IP environment in China, IPR protection environment in China.
We mentioned that there are no lawyers up here. There are plenty in the audience in case you all need any. And I don't pretend to be a lawyer either. I will say, just on the technology transfer side, I think there are some industries where it's still actually a regulation that there is shared technology transfer. So in electric cars, a joint venture must master 3 of the 3 core technologies related to the car: the motor, the battery, the drivetrain. That's a mandate, and if you don't prove that you can do that, you can't get approved. There are probably others, but I think and then you've got cyber theft, and it's hard to calculate that, I'm sure, and it's written about in the 301 investigation report, although not quantified. Right? But I think the big giant challenge, of course, is just China's a humongous market. And there are general incentives that the Chinese government encourages for technology diffusion, if not sharing, right? So if you want to invest in China, and there's 5 companies who might get into China, I think there's incentive to share. Why are there so many multinational R&D centers in China and not in Kenya? Well, I think China's market's probably a little bit bigger. So that probably is why there are more multinationals have R&D centers in Shanghai and other places rather than there. So and then I think actually the biggest emerging problem or issue, I don't call it a problem, is employees. Because 95% of how to do something is written down. The last 5%, maybe the most important, is what your employees carry around in their heads from all the experience. And so I think the movement of employees is probably going to be the biggest challenge going forward. All right, let's take a last group of a couple questions and then have things wind up. Yes, in the back.
My name is Andrew Mayer. I'm studying here at CSIS Syracuse University. And I lived in Asia for 10 years. I've been back for about 9, so I've been watching what's going on from the housing crisis to now, and the evolution of the renewable energy market. And I think 2 weeks ago, the EU agreed to lift the block on Chinese solar panels. And so I'm wondering how you see, and I think it's pretty well known that the higher efficiency cells are built in the United States, but the bulk and the quantity is in China of lower efficiency cells that now the EU is open to buying. So can you talk to that market adjustment at all?
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I'm from Brandon Hughes from FAO Global. Quick question on the Belt and Road and foreign companies getting in, U.S. firms or foreign firms getting involved. From your viewpoints, do you see any areas to which they may get involved directly or indirectly? I just came back from a trip to Xiamen and Shanghai, and it's very unclear what opportunities there were, but it was very clear what challenges there were. So I'm wondering, from your viewpoint, what are the opportunities and what are the main challenges that you foresee from U.S. firms or foreign firms getting involved? Thank you very much.
Hi there, my name is Stephanie Yoko. I'm a Hopkins Nanjing Center alum and a current student at SAIS. We spent a lot of time talking about U.S. companies, and I was just wondering if you guys can share a little bit about the impact of the trade war have on Chinese companies that export to the U.S. Thank you.
We've got 3 very good questions. Maybe the one on solar, maybe you could I think that fits into a broader conversation about Chinese overcapacity issues or other sectors that are related. So if you want to talk about solar, you can, but maybe you want to talk about the others as well. Why don't we start with Anita and then work our way down?
Yeah, I think for the Belt and Road Initiative, when we have the chance to have an interaction with the Chinese government, we always ask this question. We see there are a lot of opportunities that multinational companies like us, we can contribute and we can at least be part of it. I think the answer from the officials can always be positive. They say you can find a way, but closed doors. They will say they will tell you that this is mainly for the local companies or state-owned companies because there are a lot of infrastructure involved, right? So they really want to benefit their local company or state-owned companies. The only way in, I think, is how multinational companies can partner with a local company or state-owned company. In our case, for instance, the big, we call it 国药, so Pharma China. So they are a huge state-owned enterprises where they are going into the distribution, like everything. So if you are working with them, you probably can find a way in, but not directly involved on the Belt and Road Initiative.
For banks, particularly, I'm going to focus on U.S. banks. I don't think there's very much opportunity. Now, the reason I say is that a lot of the initial Belt Road projects tend to be infrastructure projects, which tend to be very long-term, 10, 12, 20 years. So usually commercial banks don't go that far out in terms of tenor for the loans. Maybe they're comfortable with 5 years or so, but if you're starting to look at 10, 20 years or so, then you start needing the support of development banks. And at this point in time, entities such as the China Development Bank can provide longer-term financing at cheaper below market prices than what U.S. commercial banks could possibly compete with. But there's a second issue, which is this. If you take a look at the direction of the Belt and Road, they happen to be in many countries, emerging market countries, where if they're going to have a borrower in that country, chances are under current U.S. anti-money laundering regulations, they're considered high-risk money laundering jurisdictions. And as you know, right now with U.S. banks, we're very sensitive of being fined because of anti-money laundering. And so it doesn't mean there isn't any opportunity, but there's a higher, hoops. There's a number of hoops that would add complexity to being able to support that. I think to the next question on solar panels, the fact that Europe is willing to purchase now panels from China is going to be a godsend. For a number of years, because of the NDRC seeing the solar industry as one of the encouraged industries, worthy of subsidies and so forth, there was an overcapacity issue. And certainly from a banking standpoint, their credit ratings for these solar entity producers, panel producers, it was pretty poor credit risk. So in many ways, just as the One Belt, One Road was meant to help take and absorb excess capacity of China production, the fact that Europe is willing to help out now is all the more better for the industry. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Eric?
In the presentation that Ken made, he did cite a number. So some of our members believe that they can benefit directly from the Belt and Road Initiative, and that would include insurance companies. I said earlier in my beginning remarks that our strategy is really to follow our clients. We don't really distinguish between Chinese, an American, or an international client. They are our clients. So when they go overseas to do an infrastructure project, whether it's in a Belt Road country or in the US or in South America, they will need insurance coverage. At this point, we see that as a good opportunity for a company like AIG because we have a global footprint. a global network that we can support these clients when they go overseas to pursue these infrastructure projects. There are some very big domestic insurance companies in China, but they are not global at this point. They don't really have the capacity to support these Chinese contractors when they go overseas, whether Africa, Middle East, or South America. So we see that as a good opportunity for an insurance company like AIG.
Maybe just to answer Stephanie, right, your question about Chinese company, I think one aspect of it is that there are a lot of low-value consumable producer local company which are very much export-oriented, their strategy. But now with the tariff, we see a change of strategies, a foreseeable change of strategies that they are shifting their focus back in the domestic market in China. So we'll be foreseeing some increasing competition with the local companies because they are, kind of like pulling back all their resources back in domestic market.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I honestly think the message is extremely clear from and relatively consistent across each of you and your sectors. Obviously, different opportunities, different challenges, but I think a big picture emerges. And when you when you meet with the president to explain, as Yufan asked you to do, I think he's going to take notice, because it's going to not be the typical news that he hears and has been talking about. But that's one of the great things about the United States, is that we have a very open conversation about the challenges and opportunities that we face. And it's clear that in the case of China, it's a growing market, but it's also a place of growing uncertainty. And partly because of China, partly because of Washington. And I don't think that's going to change. We really hope that the chamber comes back next year and that we can have this conversation again and we can see how you all have adapted in this environment. I'm expecting success because American companies do well whether things are stable or whether there's complications and you have to adapt. But look forward to that. And I really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. Ken and your team and the folks from up north as well in Beijing, Anita, Hanlin, Eric, everyone please join me in thanking them.